So one of the issues that was raised with the police last week, or last week or 2 weeks ago, when we raised issues about electoral violence, was, look, whose responsibility is it to probe perpetrators of electoral violence? Of course, the police would say, naturally, according to the Electoral Act, it's not the responsibility of the police, it's the responsibility of INEC to prosecute electoral violence offenders or electoral offenders generally. Well, INEC is one of the officials we'll be speaking with concerning a post-mortem of the Kogi supplementary election that happened over the weekend and other issues about the topic of discussion. Let's go to Marco in Abuja.
Thank you, Ayo. We have with us in the studio Mr. Festus Okoye, who's the National Commissioner and Chairman Voter Education and Information at INEC. We also have with us Samson Itodo, who's former director at Yaga Africa.
Executive director.
Executive, beg your pardon. Executive director at Yaga Africa. Gentlemen, you're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Good morning.
Tell us, you know, what your reading of the election was. There was a lot of controversy before, you know, Kogi finally went into the supplementary poll. One of the candidates, Senator Dilo Melaye, you know, was very, very vehement in his protestations. He took letters to INEC's offices saying that the election should be postponed. There was too much violence, one, and then also the results did not exactly reflect the wishes of the people. And he gave, you know, he gave his reasons. But INEC said, no, we're going to go ahead and we're going to conduct the polls. How would you assess the conduct of the polls as done by your people this weekend?
Well, the supplementary elections held, as you are aware, and it went smoothly. All the deployments were done sometime, you know, in some polling units. The ad hoc staff were there as early as 6:30 in the morning. And the reports we received was that the poll was generally orderly. And at the end of the day, the returning officer for the senatorial elections announced the results of the election. So it went well and it was peaceful.
Okay, so, I mean, were you on the ground to monitor the elections this time around?
Yes, we deployed to the 53 polling units where the rerun elections for Kogi West took place, but we didn't observe the court-ordered rerun elections in Ajaokuta, to be specific. And based on reports that we received from our field observers, yes, to a large extent, the process went smoothly in the 53 polling units where we all covered. As at 7:30, all the polling officials were already on ground in 52 out of the 53 polling units that we observed. But there were still some gaps and challenges that we observed. Now, one of the things that defined this rerun election was community collusion. And that's something we have to deal with in the ongoing reforms on how do we limit how communities conspire to undermine the process. In one particular community, as at 11:30 a.m., voting was stopped and counting had begun. And even when voters came to cast their vote, they were chased from the polling station to say, oh, no, the process had been concluded
at 11:30
a.m. On Saturday. There were also reports where the smart card readers were not used to accredit voters. In fact, in 7 out of the 53 polling units, our observers reported the non-use of the smart card readers for accreditation, and that again is a violation of the guidelines and produced by INEC, and so you see a situation where the lives of the polling officials were threatened by the communities. So in one particular polling unit, it was quite interesting that when the results came from the 2 voting points in those polling units, the polling official was forced to ignore the results from those polling units, even when the ballot papers were in the ballot box. And what they forced the presiding officer to do was to distribute the votes amongst the parties. And they just wrote results on the results sheets, and then was taken to collation. In fact, at collation, to be specific, in Mopamoro LGA, observers were not allowed into the collation center, and so we can't speak for the integrity of that process in Mopa Moro. And that's also one of the parties also refused to sign the results sheets at the collation center in that particular polling unit. So we still saw some egregious violations of the electoral law as well as the guidelines of INEC. And as you know, from November 16th, Yaga Africa and other civil society organizations had called for the cancellation of the election, and we don't believe in the integrity of the process. And that's why even for the supplementary elections, we can't comment on the results, because ab initio, we already called for the cancellation of the election owing to the level of violence and brigandage, as well as efforts by the political parties and security agencies to undermine the process.
So the same was still the observance for this particular supplementary election?
Yes, the same was still observed. However, the level of violence was not rampant. In fact, in terms of the critical incidents that we recorded in the supplementary elections, just hovers around one: community collusion, compelling presiding officers to write and mutilate results. We saw that in this election. Of course, the non-use of the smart card reader in 7 out of the 53 polling units where we also observed. Of course, there were also attempts by party agents to undermine and intimidate the INEC officials as well as voters in those polling units. When we looked at the deployments of party agents, in the 53 polling units, the APC had party agents in all the polling units. However, the PDP only had agents deployed in about 52. If I get my figures right, in about 52 out of in about 50 polling units out of the 53 polling units for this election. So there were still those critical incidents as observed in the November 16th, as well as in this rerun. And that really puts to the fore the discourse on the reforms to our electoral process and the fact that we need to fix our elections as soon as possible. Else, you're going to, the lethargy and the inertia of citizens will increase. Look at the turnout for all the elections.
Before we go to the turnout, let me ask Mr. Okoye to come in here. You have heard their own assessment of the observance. Do you agree in large part? Because I also want to believe that while you had officials on the ground doing the work of conducting elections, you also had people monitoring the process to ensure that the process was not compromised. Isn't that right? Yes. Now, if that is the case, do you agree largely with what they observed as is reported?
Well, we are going to have a meeting with all the resident electoral commissioners throughout the Federation tomorrow. And the conduct of the 2 elections in Bayelsa and Kogi will be on the table. Now, in relation to the supplementary elections, I told you that in almost all the polling units, we deployed before 8 a.m. in the morning. And we had trained the ad hoc staff for this particular supplementary election and giving them the guidelines of the commission in relation to what they're supposed to do at the polling units. And we had instructed them that if in any polling unit, if anybody threatens their life or they feel that their lives are in danger, that they should comply with whatever directives they are given and then escalate their reports to the collation officer. And part of our section 10 of our regulations and guidelines is to the effect that in any community or in any polling unit where the community connives and bypasses the use of the smart card reader, that the election should be taken as having been concluded in that particular polling unit, and 0 votes will be recorded for that particular polling unit. And that was made very, very clear to all the presiding officers and also to all the collation officers in both the registration areas and in the local government areas before it gets to the senatorial collation center. So that was very, 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 very clear.
Did you have cause then to declare 0 in any polling units in the supplementary polls?
Well, I don't have the report as of today, but you know, based on our regulations and guidelines and also based on the law, it is the presiding officer at the polling unit and the collation officers at the registration area centers that look at some of these things before making that particular determination. And then when it gets to the senatorial collation center where the results are declared, the collation stroke returning officer will take into consideration all those incidents. And you know, it's part of those issues that led to these supplementary elections. But I don't have the full report as at now. But the report I have as at today is that the supplementary elections went well and that we've not really recorded any incident to my own knowledge.
So, well, if there was any 0 votes recorded, I would want to believe that that would have been done at the level of the, the general collation, and that would have been recorded there. But right now, the winners the winner of that supplementary poll has already been declared. So
yes,
I don't see that
the way it goes is that if for instance, there were a problem in 3 polling units, and those 3 polling units have just 1,000 registered voters, if the 1,000 votes will not make a difference in relation to the margin of lead, the returning officer will go ahead and make a declaration.
Okay, let me ask you then, how widespread were some of the things that you observed? The 53 polling units where elections were being conducted, how widespread were the areas where you observed some of these violations that you have listed? Well,
like I mentioned, in terms of the non-use of the smart card reader, in 7 out of the 53 polling units, voters were permitted to cast their votes without going through the accreditation with the smart card reader.
7? Okay.
7 out of 53. If you look at, for instance, in Mopamoro, to be specific, observers were prevented from observing the collation process, and so we can't speak for the integrity of that process.
Mopamoro has how many wards?
I don't have that figure. But if you look, in Ijumu, in fact, in 2 polling units, to be specific, in Ijumu LGA, we saw, vote buying in the full glare of security agents. We also saw party agents intimidating the INEC officials in 2 polling units in Ijumu. The point is, it's not about how widespread these incidents are. It's about, did they really happen or should they happen in the first instance? And do they have the potential of impacting on the credibility of the process? If you have community collusion in a particular polling unit, and it is established that the INEC officials were forced by the communities to share votes, it's quite embarrassing that that's a report coming from our elections, and that shouldn't happen because it undermines the integrity of our election, regardless of how widespread they are. They shouldn't even happen in the first place. If we are
the reason why it's important to know how widespread. On the one hand, INEC says the elections were conducted and conducted well. It went smoothly. I want to believe it's not without infractions, even though when you look at that statement on the surface, you think all was well. You have to ask questions as to how did violence occur. I mean, the person whom we reported was shot. How did that person get shot if everything went smoothly? So there are questions there. However, we also know that when we go to court, what you hear is substantial compliance, where the polls where the guidelines and the rules and laws substantially complied with. And I think that's what will determine whether a result will be upturned or not, or whether that election will be regarded as credible on the whole. That's why the question of how widespread it was. If out of 53 you have up to half of the people, or of the communities there colluding and conniving, there'll be huge question marks as to the credibility of the entire process. It already has some credibility questions. I mean, coming from the Kogi and Bayelsa, from the statewide
16th.
elections conducted there. However, when you now look at the fact that we're looking at just one senatorial district, and that it's just a select few polling units that we're looking at, and it would seem that we still cannot get the process right in majority of the polls or the polling units, and there'll be huge questions to ask as to what will happen with INEC and the electoral process as we move forward. Do you want to quickly speak to that?
Let me just say this. Now, in assessing whether the supplementary elections went well, you have to also look at the mandate of the commission. Our mandate is to organize, undertake, and supervise elections. We printed the ballot papers for the supplementary elections. Nobody has complained that there was shortage of ballot papers. We deployed to all the polling units on time before 8 o'clock. All the polling units, from my own report. In fact, in some of the polling units, the ad hoc staff were there as early as 6:30 in the morning. Nobody has complained about that. Now, and nobody has also complained that the ad hoc staff were not trained or were not well trained. So everything in relation to our own preparations went well. Now, it is not our responsibility to protect our ad hoc staff. The conduct of election is a multi-stakeholder venture, and it is not the responsibility of the Independent National Electoral Commission to provide security around the polling units. Our arrangement is that there will be security at the inner cordon of the polling units and then at the outer cordon of the polling units to make sure that our staff that we have employed to conduct these elections are not put under pressure, are not intimidated, are not brought to harm. So when a community decides on its own to undermine the integrity of an electoral process in a particular polling unit, we have trained these ad hoc staff on what to do. But if, for instance, you have election in 50 polling units in a particular community, and there was no problem in over 45 of the polling units, and there was problem in just 7 of the polling units, you cannot, in all honesty, say that the entire election lacks credibility. Each polling unit stands on its own.
Yeah.
Each polling unit is sovereign on its own. So if there's a problem in a particular polling unit, our regulations and guidelines has clearly delineated and told us what to do in relation to that.
Yeah, Mr. Okoye,
Yes.
I agree that, yes, you cannot... One finger in this case will not smear everything. I mean, but in the other sense of argument, some people will say, yes, one finger has the capacity to soil everything else. That's the saying of our people. That's what we believe. So the question will be, what are we going to do? Because Mr. Observer here, Samson is not saying that, it is the fault of INEC. But if this is what is currently happening in our process, first and foremost, you've not been able to tell us whether in the communities where there was connivance, for community connivance, for instance, because you say you don't have the entirety of the report, whether indeed 0 votes were recorded. If 0 votes were recorded according to the guidelines of INEC, which says that you shouldn't, in the places where card readers are not used, and record 0, then there'll be questions as to the training that you have given your people and whether they have followed it. You don't have that yet. So there are still huge questions as to whether or not, yes, the security is not in your hands. However, whether your people are also following the guidelines that you have stipulated.
I am sure that they are following the guidelines because they are well trained. And we also have monitors and we also have supervisors who supervise these elections. And you will observe that at the level of the polling unit, you have core members, you have students of federal tertiary institutions, and then at the registration area collation center, you have senior teaching staff of federal universities doing the collation. All these categories of officers running this election have been trained in relation to what to do when a particular issue arises. So, but at the end of the day, I'm going to get a full report of what has transpired. But the independent national
just a minute. Reports were made public as well.
No.
In the interest of transparency,
I'm coming. We accredited all pool agents for all political parties running the elections. We accredited all domestic and international observers who want to observe this election. We accredited them both at the polling unit level and at the level of the collation center. So if anything has happened at the polling unit, the party agents or poll agents ought to know. If anything had happened at the collation center, the observers and the party agents ought to know. So if there's a collusion at the level of the community, where were the party agents when this collusion was taking place? You know, no, I mean,
Mr. Okoye,
if we have accredited 20 party agents belonging to the different political parties, and all of them are there, and then there was this community collusion, the implication is that all of them connive together in order to undermine the process.
Mr. Okoye, and that would not be strange because that has been recorded before in our polls where party agents are bought over. I mean, we've heard party people complain about that, about when they do not have the financial muscle, their polling agents can be bought over. And then he also mentioned polling units where observers were not allowed to even observe what the process. He kept on saying we cannot speak to the integrity of that process. So in that instance, what do you say?
Well, we have done what the law and the Constitution obligates us to do.
Which is
accredit them to observe this particular process. And no domestic election observer and no international observer has said, oh, INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission, prevented us from observing any of the processes of the election because we accredit them because we want them to see what we are doing, and we also want them to also report honestly on what they have seen.
Mr. Okoye, I don't think this is about, who has the blame for this. I just think that whatever it is that, the observers are reporting, as long as you're not disputing it based on what you have also seen yourself, the question will be, how do we ensure that the process has integrity moving forward? That people are not saying, it happened in this state, there was no repercussion for it, there was no, there were no consequences, so to speak. And as such, we are also going to do the same. And that would spell anarchy. It is something definitely, some of these observances, things that are violating the process, things that make it look like as if we're going back instead of moving forward, should definitely worry the Commission. Yes,
we are really concerned and we are worried. And that is why the Commission is also pushing that as quickly as possible, that the National Assembly should bring into fruition the Electoral Offences Commission Bill and Tribunal, so that those who commit infraction at the level of the polling unit, we should have something like a mobile court, a mobile election court on election day to deal speedily with some of those issues, and also that this particular court commission should have the power to arrest, should have the power to investigate, and should also have the power to prosecute electoral offenders. And we are pushing very vigorously to make sure that this comes into fruition.
Do you think this will help at all?
Yes, it will. But 3 key points, Maupe. We shouldn't treat the supplementary election in isolation of the November 16th election. I think that we can't divulge the fact that this November 16th was undermined, and the integrity of that election has been called to question, and that's why we still stand by our position that INEC should have cancelled that election, even though the Commission has said it doesn't have power to actually cancel the election. But that election cannot be regarded as an election. The second point, and which INEC also needs to address, is did INEC conduct supplementary elections in all the affected polling units in the November 16th elections? And there's a lot of questions INEC needs to answer. First, there's a particular polling unit, Ajayi Crowder polling unit, in Ward A in Lokoja. We were there. I was there. Both Situation Room observers, both the British, the international observers were there, and the process was going on smoothly, and that process was disrupted, and the election was... In fact, Kayla was actually at that particular polling unit. We were surprised to see that that polling unit was not amongst the polling units where the rerun election was conducted. And there are also other polling units as well. So one is actually wondering, how did the commission come up with the 53 polling units where these rerun elections were conducted? And there are a lot of questions that the commission needs to answer to protect its own transparency and integrity.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's an ongoing conversation. We wish you could finish everything this morning, but I have to thank you both because we're totally out of time. Mr. Festus Okoye is the National Commissioner and Chairman, Voter Education and Information at INEC, and Samson Itodo is Executive Director at Yaga Africa. Thank you for coming on Sunrise Daily.
Thank you.